Good evening. I'm Kelly Wright. Thanks for joining me as we spend this next hour together. I do sincerely hope that wherever you are, that you're safe, that you're well, taking care of yourself and your family because you matter. My opening observations tonight, racism. We're going to have a conversation this evening on race because it is still a critical issue that is hurting our country, particularly nowadays. So we have to continue this dialogue. Tonight, we're talking to four men of faith who are not just talking about racial reconciliation, but actually doing something about it. You see, they're focusing on how to break down the barriers of race on every level, spiritually, politically, racially, and economically. You'll recall the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, C.T. Vivian, and the late Congressman John Lewis all fought for racial equality in this country. They kept trying to get people to understand that we must become our brothers and sisters keepers. Because of that, these four men have stepped out to continue that legacy, to have that dialogue, but to actually start doing the work, the hard work, to create an atmosphere of racial equality on every level. So we'll talk about that and how we can strive to become truly one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. After all, united we stand. And those are my opening observations. Well, I talked to these gentlemen last week. That was before what took place on Sunday. And I have to bring you up to date on what took place on Sunday because, again, it revolves around the issue of race. Watch this. You're looking at video now of a very heartbreaking situation. That's a mother and four children that police detained and handcuffed on Sunday after mistaking their SUV for a stolen vehicle. Now, police apologized for the incident of their officers actually pulling guns out on Brittany Gilliam, her 6-year-old daughter, 12-year-old sister, and 14-year-old and 17-year-old nieces. The Facebook video shows the girls on the ground, and you can hear the children crying. When people standing by try to intervene to help the family, the police chase them away. Now, interim police chief Vanessa Wilson called Brittany Williams and apologized for the incident. Police offered help for the children who may have been traumatized by it all, and she reached out to victims advocate to offer age-appropriate therapy, adding the city will pay the costs. In an interview with CNN, Gilliam explained that police wanted to place handcuffs on her, and she gladly agreed to that because she felt they had a job to do. And then she also stated that under the Wright protocol, she was cooperating with them. But instead, the police went one step further, pointing guns at the four kids, and then proceeded to start handcuffing the children. And all that they were really trying to do was go to a nail salon. So to talk more about this issue, just to break it all out and give us some analysis, Bobby Kipper, he is the founder and executive director of the National Center for the Prevention of Community Violence. He is also a 30-year law enforcement officer, retired now, but he's worked with the Bush administration as well as the Commonwealth Attorney for the state of Virginia. And Bobby, I see a lot of incidents that take place, but in this one, it's just heartbreaking to watch and to see these little girls handcuffed, lying face down on the ground, crying, and the mother actually stating, I can give you the information. And they didn't take the information from her. They just treated this as their suspect. And when people try to intervene, they back those people off. What happened here?
Well, Kelly, I do think, obviously one of the things that we train police officers nationwide is to have some discretion. I'm not really sure that I agreed with the discretion at this particular point. I think there was a lack of it. And from my perspective, again, we're not talking about a car full of adults who were running from the police, who the police had to chase and sort of, got into a chase and stop situation. Apparently, the car had been reported stolen at some point, and I do understand that there was some caution used when the car was stopped. But to take young children out of a vehicle and to lay them face down on a parking lot is a little bit beyond, what I would feel like that the necessary discretion would be. I just feel bad for the kids. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about it, the shock of that will that'll be a long time in their minds, and that's really unfortunate from our perspective when you talk about policing.
Absolutely. No matter the fact that the police chief has apologized to Brittany Gilliam, the mother and aunt of those girls, and the fact that she's offering victims advocates help that the city will pay for therapy for the children who have been traumatized. But the bottom line is, Bobby, if they had de-escalated the situation, stayed in their vehicles and called in the report, they would have likely found out that the car, which in fact is owned by Brittany Gilliam, was reported stolen and returned by the Aurora Police Department to her the very next day. And that was more than a month ago. So,
I would agree. There seemed like there was an issue with police records in this situation. Normally when a car is stolen and it's found and given back to the rightful owner, that is usually taken out of the system. Now, obviously I don't work for that police department, so I don't know where that fell through. But the issue is that the rightful owner had the vehicle back. I would assume that they had talked to the police about saying that the car had been found and that they had it in their possession. Again, the issue that I had was taking children, young children, and laying them face down handcuffed. That's a major issue for me because it really moves beyond what your policy. I mean, you can write policy all day long. What we've got to understand is that there are a lot of times there are hard, fast policies, there are hard, fast laws. But remember, what we train police officers on nationwide is the rule of discretion. You have discretion to really use. At some point, you have to use some given sense that you have that children are not going to be out there, in a stolen car, basically a threat to your safety.
yeah.
Police officers respond to threats to safety, and when you talk about young children being a threat to safety, is obviously they had exited the vehicle. They were not putting up any fuss or any fight, from what I read and from what I understand. And so at that particular point, you have to use some good adult common sense.
And you're not afraid to have police departments talk about the the problem of race, and it is a problem that has to be addressed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And remember, one of the things that you and I totally agree with, and I've talked about this for years, is that these are not just, issues of policing versus citizens. These are issues of human rights. And, the first thing that we've got to get right in policing in America today is to understand the bottom line of human rights and to really respect that going in. And when that becomes our call, it becomes our philosophy, it becomes our training, it becomes the way we do business, then we're going to all be better off. And Kelly, I really believe, as a veteran of this and trainer and years of this, I really believe that we can get there. I really do. And, it's my pledge to keep driving the train to say, let's all come together and let's fan the flames and get them lowered. And let's finally start talking about solutions. We're
Yeah.
at that point that this is going to keep happening until we do some deep talking, some deep conversation that hopefully will lead to solutions.
Yeah, that's why on this show tonight we've got a dialogue on race, not pertaining so much to police, but also pertaining to how we economically enhance communities of color and build them up from a faith-based perspective for racial reconciliation. Bobby, thank you for joining me in such short notice to keep us informed and to provide your analysis on this situation. Let's talk more on an expansive dialogue, as we've done before, on how we get police departments to become more racially sensitive and more aware, and certainly better training. Bobby Kipper, thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for having me.
So joining me tonight is a very special group of men who are very active in their community and doing so many great things to help change the culture as well as transform their communities so that they're not bitter but better. And they represent Trinity Park Limited, which is in the 757 area code area. That's better known as Hampton Roads to many. I lived there for many years and worked there as a reporter and anchor. And I'm delighted to meet the representatives of Trinity Park Limited, Eric Thompson, James Payne, Willie T. Butler, and Ron Atkinson. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me tonight on the program. And we're going to have a great conversation about race. What do we do about bigotry, prejudice, and racism? More importantly, how do we make sure that our hearts and minds are clear so that we're putting forth an agenda where the rubber meets the road and transforming communities that have been underserved, marginalized, and forgotten, which becomes a breeding space or a breeding ground for anger, hostility, resentment, and it's healing is hard to bring when you have that kind of element taking place. Tell me more about this wonderful organization called Trinity Park Limited.
The Trinity Park Limited is a consortium of community stakeholders, faith-based thought leaders who have been actively engaged in the communities each of us serve in ministry, in nonprofit organization, and in regular for-profit companies as well. As entrepreneurs, we are gathered together to basically combine our resources to be one big toolkit with a whole set of different resources under its umbrella. And the thing that we found most important is for us to be engaged from a kingdom perspective. That is to say, to be focused on doing things in a transformative way. We have to recognize that bringing holistic community development to bear on the circumstance in an area is what has to be done. It may be important to look at the issue of affordable homes and also of jobs, but clearly without first creating those revenue generators, such as jobs that come from businesses that you create, the balance is skewed. So our approach has always been to evaluate in these areas, how can we approach these areas holistically, considering the need to generate an economic base first and foremost. And through that base to be able to develop jobs with high paying job skills, which then enables those same residents to then be able to afford housing, first transitional from renter to owner. And then of course, all along the way, coming alongside, as Jesus has taught us to do, preferring our neighbor as ourselves and ensuring that none among us lack anything they need. And so that is the fourth element of our criteria, that we are providing programmatic services every stage of life to the residents in the communities where we feel called of God to go and to serve.
Wow, that's a whole person approach, if you will, mind, body, and soul. Indeed. And it mirrors what Dr. King talked about. And the reason why I raised him up in this context is because of the fact that we have just bid final farewell to some of the people who marched with him, C.T. Vivian, as well as,
yes.
So many other people who have been in those shoes, John Lewis, and they all talked about service, and they talked about the beloved community. James Payne, to initiate a plan like this and to make it happen, you've got to have an organizational structure. So how do you organize this to effectuate the kind of change that is so desperately needed in communities that are underserved and marginalized, principally communities of color?
Well, one of the main focus in which I am involved in, I have professional training as a chaplain. And in chaplain, the word chaplain means good Samaritan. In other words, I'm on the ground in the field of battle, specifically doing what God said was to love my neighbor as myself. I think if we're going to organize a particular structure to support sort of Martin Luther King legacy, we have to know what the people are experiencing on the ground. And by the way, I, in my life, have been one of those people. There are people that need opportunity now. For instance, if a person is behind on the rent, they also need money to go to work. And so you have to have a system in place that actually responds to everything.
All right, James, thank you for that. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue on with our dialogue with Trinity Park Limited about what's going on in the Hampton Roads, Virginia area, because it's a microcosm of what's happening across the country. And we want to talk about that and how they deal with the, not just the racial issue there, but how they're trying to circumvent hostilities between races and between Black communities and the police community by building homes and giving people wealth. We'll talk about that when we return. Welcome back to the program. So tonight I'm actually having a conversation about race, but from a practical standpoint of what do you do about dealing with the societal ills stemming from racism? As you know, there is a divide in our country. It's racially motivated. It's also politically motivated. And one of the things that's often overlooked are some of the contributing factors to it. Now, the gentlemen on with me represent Trinity Park Limited. We've just spoken to James Payne, Willie T. Butler. We heard a little bit from Ron Atkinson. I want to hear now from Eric Thompson, who's also part of this this plan there. And Eric, one of the things that I hear from the group is that you're going after healing the racial divide by reconciling some of the systemic issues that persist and exist within housing. And we all know that here in America, or anywhere for the matter, home is where the heart is. And if the Black community, the brown community, or any community of color is lacking adequate housing, then it's difficult for them to build wealth. It's difficult for them to feel equal.
Yeah, ownership, as you know, if you rent a car, you treat it a lot differently than if you own a car. Very few of us have ever returned a rental car and had it washed before we returned it. But if you own it, you're taking good care of it. And I think the same thing happens in a home. And what has transpired really since the Fair Housing Act of 1910 has been a systemic blocking of the ability of people of color to own homes. And it was whether we didn't provide lending or we provided red line districts that basically if you lived in that district, you couldn't get funding. And we essentially created a massive wealth gap that has now moved to the point that it's separated by a factor of 10. And that's almost inconceivable that there's 10 times as much wealth in the white community as in the Black community on average. And so one of the ways you can fix that is by home ownership, because I can build wealth within a home. I can't build wealth if I'm renting a place. And so what Trinity has come up with is how do we transition someone from being a renter to an owner, from being an owner to a contributor, from being a contributor to a mentor? Because really we have to go through that whole cycle. And so the holistic look at how do we take care of someone is critical to what we think we should do.
Well, that's really a wonderful approach, Eric. And Ron, if I'm hearing Eric correctly, he talked about a cycle of wealth building, which would go against a cycle of poverty when you can
Correct.
go after those systems that have kept Black Americans down on the bottom rung of the ladder. Now you're affording them a possibility, a probability of getting into a middle class and leveling the playing field in terms of economic parity.
Right. Right, absolutely. So, you know, if you look at one of the things that we've tracked is we've tracked how long does a dollar stay within each community. So if I spend a dollar, if I earn a dollar, when I spend it, that earned dollar stays in the white community for 34 days. If you're Asian, it stays in the community for almost 13 days. If you're Hispanic, it stays in the community for almost 7 days. And in the African American community, it stays in for 38 minutes. And so we've not built an infrastructure. We've structurally destroyed the infrastructure. So we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Black Wall Street in Tulsa. I mean, that had the perfect infrastructure. That, and if in Tulsa, at that era, in the turn of the century, it stayed in the Black community for a year. Just think of that. I mean, we went from a year to 38 minutes. And that's really just because you had wealth creation and wealth assimilation that we have really systematically figured out in culture to dismantle. And so part of the vision of Trinity is to create workforce development, right? That creates jobs, that creates businesses. So the entrepreneurial thought of building block on block on block. But your first step has to be, you've got to have affordable housing that you would want to live in and that you can become an owner of.
I mean, I'm sure this has been tried in other areas. Why is it becoming successful in the Hampton Roads, Virginia area?
So the concept is that you build a family that has resources. So you identify that every family is really an enterprise. If you start that at the beginning point, that's matches scripture. You're fearfully and wonderfully made, and marvelous are his works in you. That being the beginning point, then you start putting those resources in there, those support systems that our family really needs to exercise that. I'll give you a good example. In America, our house concept is a liability concept. Mm-hmm. Okay. Once you take away the liability and make it an asset concept, that means you identify that there's something there that draws to it. And once you can do that, you have strong success. The other last point is that when you go in and work with the family, we go in and work with the community where the family is also. Okay, so you don't work with a family in isolation. As James said, you create these structures that have economy within the structures themselves. But you go into the community, identifying the lifeblood that's there, build that up. Now you have a sustainable community, okay? When you have sustainability, you can have replication.
Wow, that's remarkable. When we come back, I want to talk to you about how that is taking shape and form, and if the president and other political leaders in Washington and even in Virginia are taking note so that they can use this as a model of healing the racial wounds and bridging the divide economically, especially in a time of COVID-19. Back with more after this. Welcome back to the program. I'm having a very thought-provoking conversation and actually an eye-opening conversation. It's informative, it's inspirational. Men who comprise the organization Trinity Park Limited, they're operating within the 757 area code. That's Hampton Roads, Virginia, which comprises some of the great cities. But more importantly, what's interesting that we heard from Ron Atkinson talking about how slavery began in the 757 area code. Therefore, it makes sense that reconciliation would begin and repairing the breach would begin there as well, and in a very instructive and life-changing way. And to be clear, Willie Butler, the reason why we talk about 757 and slavery is that in 1619, 400 years ago, Blacks came to the shores of Port Comfort, Virginia, which is right there at Fort Monroe, Virginia, just a stone's throw away from Hampton, Virginia. And I say that because a lot of people enjoy it. Hampton University, one of the prominent historically Black colleges and universities. But historically, here we are, we're seeing what happened and in 1619, but you don't stay there. We came enslaved, but they were kings and queens and mathematicians and thought leaders and builders. And now you're actually taking that model and saying, yeah, but here, 400 years later, this is what we're doing to change the economic divide and the racial divide we have in this country. Tell me more about that plan and why it's so necessary for now. Now is the time.
Well, Kelly, I think there are two paradigm shifts that are occurring simultaneously today. And one of them has been alluded to by each of my colleagues. And they're right on in expressing the urgency to see true reconciliation that occurs across what we're calling a racial divide. Frankly, I get a little disappointed that we're still continually using language, particularly as the church, that implies that there are multiple races when the word of the Lord says so clearly that he hath made of one blood all the nations of the earth. So I'm not quite sure why we continue in that narrative and allow that narrative to kind of build the premise by which we create policy. So that's just my own take on it. But I think the second paradigm that's occurring is spiritual. And that is to say, we have reached in that 400-year mark a pouring out of God's grace, his grace in a way that is being represented in the issue of reconciliation, because here you have different groups that are divisive, who have been arguing about their identity and the lack of equality, who the Lord is now saying, you're still all my children. I've made all of you. You are equal in my eyes. And yet among yourselves, you have this unresolved hatred and tension that has built on an economic scale, that has occurred politically, that has divided you as a people so that you're no longer capable of really being effective for my purposes, which is to represent his kingdom in the earth. And so I think that latter paradigm is an overlay where God is saying to us, kind of get beyond the level where you're simply addressing each other on issues of reconciliation from a race base, but understand that the presence that I require, the desire that I have of you is to elevate all of you to a place of knowing yourselves in me. And this is where I think Trinity Park is being given a special platform with which to become very inclusive in the debates that are going on politically, but more importantly, to empower the church to become more than just a place that people attend on Sundays, but to be engaged on a 7-day, 24-hour-a-day moment in every sphere of influence throughout a community. So within 757, you've got pastors, you've got lay leaders, you've got nonprofits, all of whom are faith-based, who are engaged in education, in marketplace endeavors, in finance, in government. And I think that element is the one that we need to kind of refocus ourselves on. It's a new platform. It's a higher level platform that can only be properly exercised if we remain steadfast in looking at it from a kingdom perspective and not resort to the civil, somewhat very traditional method of protests and things that we've done in the past. And I'm not sure that I directly answered your question, but that is what comes to mind as a way of addressing what we in 757 are doing uniquely. Case in point, if I could just take another moment, part of the idea we have with respect to a specific community right now, which I think Ron might refer to, is going in and building or rebuilding a supermarket that has closed its doors in this community. So here is another major enterprise that simply picked itself up and left. And obviously any of the business opportunities, jobs, revenues that it may have created for the community are now gone. And our resolve is to do the following. We're going to bring together 10 churches who serve that area. And we're going to partner with them, give them a 50% ownership of building a new supermarket, so that now each of those 10 churches and all the constituency that they have as congregations are now owners of a business enterprise within their own community. This gives each of them the ability to hire 10% of the staff, to collect 10% of the revenues, but have an operational oversight as well as a responsibility to the community. And we feel as Trinity Park Limited, if we can continue to engage the church at various levels such as this, their involvement within each community will be so much more significant that some of what we've been encountering as reconciliation will be almost a thing of the past.
We'll be back with more of my dialogue on race after this. Well, Eric, let me bring you in here because it does require, if we're going to get through this racial divide, and we will, I believe, it requires for that all people, white, black, come to the table, just as they did during the civil rights struggle when Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was out trying to rectify wrongs that have been committed so long. And now we find ourselves years later visiting those same battlegrounds of thought.
Yeah.
What's your reaction in terms of what you see and how we heal as a nation?
So I think that the two things that COVID and social unrest have done as a nexus, so they've coincided, in God's perfect plan to first isolate us, and God got our attention in isolation, and then create tension that in isolation we couldn't deal with. So we had time to think. So when you remove people from their daily flow and take their rhythm out, then they have time to open their eyes and see. And I think one of the things that the media in a positive way has done is the brutal killing of George Floyd was so graphic and so visceral that you had to stop and say, is this a rarity or is this what's going on? And I think what's happened in the moderate white community, so this is, we have left, right, and middle. In the middle, I think this group has never been, they've never associated themselves as racists. And what happened is you realized you were participating in a structure that was racist. And by that definition, then you were a racist participant. And I think for that group, that wake-up call has caused them to say, that's not what I want to be. That's not the way where I want to be identified. And now that I know, I have no excuse, because now if I ignore that information, then I move further to a active participant, right? And so for me, the choice was, let's figure out how do we fix this on the front end. And we started over a year ago with a group of people praying every Thursday morning, and really praying for God to move among us and to break down 4 barriers. So I look at my rectangle around me, right? And the church has had a barrier of race. They've had a barrier of denomination. We've had barriers of geography. And finally, we've had economic barriers. And we've allowed God's church to be divided on those 4 themes. It's very hard to not feel close to someone when you pray with them on a weekly basis. The Spirit then unites you in a way that can't be broken easily. As my friend Ron says, a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And really, we've seen that all over the 757 in the last 22 weeks that COVID has kept us isolated, and then we've moved through this cycle.
And we'll be back with more of the conversation on race that we're having after the break. Before we close out, I want to ask Ron and Willie for a final assessment of where they see America going in the future, because we've got the president talking about sending federal troops into cities like Chicago, into the heart of the Black community because of violence. There are a lot of concerns that people have. I think but to my point, I've often said that instead of doing that, the president should go into the heart of the community and sit down and talk to people, just like all of you have been doing there in the Hampton Roads, Virginia area, the 757 area code, and developing a bond of trust. Even though you have different political persuasions and ideologies, you're still bringing yourselves together through reconciling your differences to make sense of your present and build a future and a hope. So on that, I'll give you a final word there, Ron and Willie.
To be honest with you, brother, I think what we're doing right now is the church. I've been to like 4 different events that were acknowledging that a transformation needs to happen, and I was there documenting it with my photography. And every one of those, Kelly, it was a peaceful outcome, even with those that didn't agree, but they were led by the church. And so that says that when the church is occupying space, politically, economically, family, religiously, media, entertainment, darkness cannot prevail. So if we continue to show up, then I believe that will send a signal to the White House that there is hope. Right now, until we take the position of activism from a kingdom position, there is no hope. But the more we go every day doing this, just like one neighborhood at a time, one block at a time, intentionally, look, let me tell you, the transition, it's already really happening. But the thing is, by you being where you are, we're able to get the truth, the great news out. Okay, that's the thing that's so powerful. Because if you're thinking about all the national narrative that's been going on, it's been coming from the media that's in the community. It's in social media. It's in the camera. So the story is on the street before it gets on the network. So what happens if we get the story on the street that God is doing? Oh, buddy, you're talking about wow, wait. So that's kind of my pitch on
it. Kelly, if we begin with the premise that the churches that have been established throughout America in various cities and communities are ordained of God, that the men and women who preside over those churches chose those locations because that's where God said, build my church, then the greatest thread of commonality is the church in every community around America, around the world for that matter. So if we can begin with that premise and understand that it is through the church that God wants the building of community to occur, and that the type of community is one in which there are no differences that are being accentuated and promoted, but rather that because of the unity of the Spirit, we approach the idea of community with having all things in common, much aligned with what the first church of Acts was really demonstrating to us. And so I just feel very strongly that organizations such as the movement.org and what Eric alluded to earlier, Trinity Park Linden and others, if we continue as instruments of faith, moving on behalf of what God has called us to, then it's time to tear down the 4 walls. It's time to undo those partitions that have caused us theologically, doctrinally, and in other things to not see the commonality and the strength of unity. But if we can unveil that and begin to function as a universal church where Jesus Christ is Lord, and that ultimately is the premise from which we begin to build community, I think there's a tremendous saving grace and a more immediate remedy for transformation. Ultimately, if everything occurs as we would like to see through what the Lord has given us as a vision, when we talk about holistic community development, these are communities that will be comprised of people from every walk of life. And there will be no major distinctions drawn outside of the scope of what those peer-to-peer relations build on. But hopefully central to every single one of them will be a modeling of what the kingdom of God would look like in the earth today, were we able to model it through community. And that's our goal.
I want to thank all of you for being on the program today, and certainly you've opened up a great dialogue about what you're doing there in Virginia. And it's so important to, in my opinion, to reflect that and show that, because as you stated too many times in the media, we're constantly talking about what's going on, and usually it's a reaction to the infractions that have taken place in our society. You've seen those infractions, you've seen people get violated, and instead of standing on the sidelines, you're now actively engaged. And what all of you have talked about reminds me of Dr. King so eloquently talked about, and that was establishing a beloved community. Well, to get there, that means you've got to do the hard work to make it happen.
That's right.
And it starts with prayer, it starts with faith. And he wasn't shy about that. And sadly, I think in the society that we have today, we've omitted that rather than including that. So, gentlemen, thank you all for taking the time out to share with me your vision and the fact that you're already effectually causing some change there in the 757 area.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you
for
all.
your time, Kelly.
Thank you.
We'll be back with the final word after this. And welcome back. I want to thank my guests for appearing on tonight's program, and I especially want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out to watch. My final word is hopefully we've invited and ignited to spread love, freedom.
That means you
Good night.
and you
on the love train.
get on board.
All creeds and colors,
Brothers
all sisters and
and
brothers
sisters,
on the love train.
get on board the love train. Everyone's invited. We're all united on the love train. Get on board. All creeds and colors, my sisters and brothers, get on board on the love train. Woo-hoo!
If you don't feel the
Yeah.
groove inside, give it
Yeah.
time, the rhythm will find.
It's alright,
Love train,
just give it time.
love train, love train.
Keep on marching on.